I'm talking tonight about the IRA, the Republican Congress and the Blueshirts, and really in terms of the conflict in Spain, the participants from Ireland in general came from among both those milieux, both on the left and the right. And I particularly want to talk about the IRA in the years before the Spanish conflict, and as to why some of its volunteers at least might have ended up in Spain, and why most of them of course did not. In September 1935, a senior Garda informed the government that a recent IRA convention had instructed the IRA Army Council to use the full power of the army in military action to re-establish the Republic within the next 12 months. Despite this, the Garda felt there was no cause for alarm, because in his view the decision was nothing more than an attempt to put some spectacular objective before the IRA rank and file in order to stem the disorganisation and disintegration that threatens their organisation's very existence. Now, this was a remarkably relaxed analysis, given that according to the Garda's own figures, the IRA had over 8,000 members in the 26 counties and was an armed organisation committed to the overthrow of the Free State. In contrast, a similar report in August 1931, when the strength of the IRA was estimated at about 4,800, had painted a far more alarming picture. Then the Garda Commissioner Owen O'Duffy, again relevant to Spain obviously, had claimed that his force was in a hopeless position because the IRA were appearing with ever more vigour and publicity and establishing themselves as an open rival to government authority in many areas of the state. O'Duffy alleged that a combination of fear and intimidation had made the conviction of IRA suspects almost impossible. He said any person charged with conspiring to overthrow the state by violence who refuses to plead and adopts a contemptuous attitude to the court is practically certain of acquittal. And his report was a precursor to a major security clampdown on behalf of the Common Gael government in the winter of 1931, which some people feared might bring the Free State again to the verge of another civil war. And both those assessments tell us much, I think, actually, about the popular legitimacy of the 26 counties. Prior to 1932, support for the IRA reflected the fact that a substantial section of the population remained at least ambivalent about the Free State. However, by 1936, Fianna Fáil had succeeded in bringing all but a very small minority into its orbit, and those prepared to actively oppose the state were being marginalised. And of course this was partly the context as well for the split with the Republican Congress and the various other fractures which occur. But between 1923 and 1936, the IRA was a constant actor in Irish life. Despite its defeat in the Civil War, it remained a sizeable and relatively well-armed organisation. In fact, in modern terms, the IRA was an extremely well-armed organisation. In 1924, for example, just after the Civil War, it numbered about 15,000 men, concentrated in the west and south of the Free State, but they had access to about 4,000 rifles, 1,000 handguns, and over 100 machine guns of various types, which is arguably better equipped than they had been during the War of Independence. However, by 1926, incomplete returns on membership show that the organisation was in decline, had perhaps about 5,000 members. At least some of this was due to emigration of large numbers of Republicans, particularly from the west of Ireland. If we jump forward a bit to the early 1930s, by May 1933, a year after Fianna Fáil had first come to power, the number of IRA members in the Free State had risen to over 10,000, while by early 1935 this was still, according to Garda estimates, at between 8,000 and 9,000. So again, we're talking about a lot. In terms of Irish republicanism and the Irish left, we're talking about an awful lot of people. However, just 2 years later, in 1936, the Gardaí were reporting that everywhere the IRA is losing strength and local interest and sympathy, and numbers were again on the decline, down to about 4,000, which is still quite a few people. Now, in 1931, when Owen O'Duffy was demanding extra powers to deal with the IRA, he'd been prepared to concede that the IRA was the direct descendant of the armed forces which opposed the Free State Army in 1922 to 23. But by 1936, the Fianna Fáil government would refer contemptuously to what it described as the new IRA, which they said was not the same organisation which had either fought the Black and Tans or opposed the Free State in the Civil War. And this again is something that I'll mention later on. Now, in fact, the majority of the IRA's leadership well into the 1930s were veterans of the revolutionary period from 1916 to 1923. Until 1925, these included men who'd led the organisation during the Civil War, such as Frank Aiken, Tom Derrick and PJ Rutledge, Sean Moylan and others. By 1927, however, many of these men had either left or been expelled for supporting the new Fianna Fáil party. Nevertheless, those who replaced them, such as Moss Toomey, who became Chief of Staff during 1926, Sean Russell, who became Quartermaster General in 1927, Peadar O'Donnell, George Plunkett, and even Sean MacBride, had all been active during the War of Independence, and indeed some had been active as far back as the Easter Rising. However, it was true that by 1932, most of the IRA's rank and file and most of their junior officers were men who, in the IRA's own words, had attained manhood after the Civil War. In other words, people who are joining the IRA in the 1930s are obviously too young to have been involved in the War of Independence or Civil War. By the 1930s, most of these volunteers were drawn from the working class and rural poor. A detailed intelligence report on the IRA's Dublin Brigade in 1933 found that the majority of its officers were either workers or unemployed. And I think there is a bit of a social change in the makeup of the IRA in the 1920s and 1930s as well. It becomes more working class, in fact, over that decade. Despite the experience of the IRA during the revolutionary period, they didn't see themselves primarily as a guerrilla army or indeed as a secret society. Indeed, the IRA's 1925 convention had agreed that an attempt to overthrow the Free State government by obstructive or guerrilla tactics can only end disastrously, and that the army should be organised and trained with the object of placing a republican government in power by means of a coup d'etat. The IRA saw itself as preparing for an insurrection rather than for any form of guerrilla war. And most routine IRA activity involved practicing drill. Weapons training was carried out only intermittently, at least in the 1920s, and most IRA volunteers did not have ready access to arms. The IRA understood that many of its volunteers were actually bored by the constant training and parading and repetition, and that this was one reason for a very high turnover of membership. And again, what you do find right throughout the 1920s is that lots of young men join the IRA and they leave relatively quickly when the IRA essentially doesn't let them do anything. Nevertheless, the IRA leadership stressed that drilling and parading was vital in order for it to become a serious military force. And most of the IRA's activity, in fact, was based around what we would consider political work. Volunteers were supposed to sell the weekly newspaper on Fublocht, although many failed to do so. They were supposed to sell Easter lilies. They were supposed to paint slogans on walls relating to various campaigns. They were sometimes ordered to campaign in elections in support of Republican candidates, and much of what an IRA volunteer did would seem to us to be what we would consider political activity rather than military activity. As late as 1934, the IRA leadership were explaining that it's the doing of the small and apparently unimportant tasks that collectively builds up the efficiency of organisation. For example, to put up or distribute posters or handbills, to deliver a dispatch, may at a particular time be as important as attending a parade to learn how to use a machine gun. So in other words, they put quite a lot of emphasis on political and agitational activity. Now, the most notable political shift, and one that's obviously relevant to discussion of Spain, was the fact that by 1927 the IRA is turning to the left in ideological terms. This is in part due to the influence of socialists such as Peadar O'Donnell and George Gilmore, but it also reflected the belief of Moss Toomey and others that the organisation had to embrace some form of radicalism in order to remain relevant. And under the editorship of Peadar O'Donnell, on Fublocht in particular, became a very lively newspaper reporting on land and labour struggles and also on international issues as well. And during this period, the IRA also sought aid from the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1929, the Army Council sent greetings to the Soviet leadership saying that they wanted to express to the Russian people their greetings and congratulations on the anniversary of their revolution, which has freed them from economic slavery and exploitation. The Irish people have watched with admiration the successful defence of the Russian Revolution against its foes. The revolution has given hope and confidence to all people who are striving to free themselves from political and economic servitude and exploitation by imperialist regimes. Now, there were pragmatic reasons for messages like this, because during this period the IRA are exchanging intelligence with the Russians. They're also receiving money from the Soviet Union as well, and many of these messages were secret. But it was also the case that at least until the early 1930s, the IRA was prepared to adopt pro-Soviet positions publicly. In May 1931, for example, Moss Toomey asserted that if it is communism to undo the conquest, to end robbery and exploitation by a privileged minority, then Tone, Emmett, Mitchell, Lawler, Connolly, Pearse and Mellows were communists, and the Irish Republican Army is a communist organisation. Now, whatever about the truth of his statement, the fact that he was prepared to say it openly, I think is significant. And by 1931, the impact of the Great Depression, which as well as deepening hardship, led to a decline in the numbers of people being able to leave Ireland, led to a revival in fortune for the IRA. And by 1931, the IRA is certainly recruiting. Toomey is reporting extraordinary growth among local units, and the IRA is encouraging its units to come out publicly as possible, as the morale of the men will allow. In the autumn of 1931, the IRA leadership set up a new political party called Saor Éire, which was explicitly socialist, and this was established as the IRA's political wing. Now, the response of the Cumann na Gael government to this, and also to the IRA's increasingly bold paramilitary activities, was a major security crackdown, accompanied by a Red Scare and clerical denunciation. The bishops in October 1931 issued a pastoral which expressly denounced communism and its link with the IRA. In terms of security, the IRA weathered the storm, but politically they were very badly burnt by the association with communism, and in fact politically they never really recovered from it. In the midst of what the IRA called the coercion period, the clampdown, Cumann na Gael called a general election. And despite formal orders against participation in elections, the IRA admitted that the hatred against the regime was so intense that volunteers could not be restrained from voting against their candidates. So in 1932, again quite pragmatically, the IRA threw its weight behind Fianna Fáil and campaigned for Fianna Fáil in that election. Fianna Fáil formed a minority government for the first time with the support of the Labour Party in early 1932, and after Fianna Fáil came to power, Frank Aiken, who was now Minister for Defence, contacted Moss Toomey and offered the IRA the opportunity to merge with Fianna Fáil, with the government essentially. And he also released all IRA prisoners held in the Free State in the spring of 1932. IRA leadership were very wary of this, naturally enough. They noted that Fianna Fáil expected to control any such organisation that came out of a merger, and despite several meetings with the Fianna Fáil leadership during 1932, they ultimately declined their offers. But Fianna Fáil in power presented huge challenges for the IRA. As Moss Toomey later explained, he said, nobody visualised a free state which Republicans were not supposed to attack. Yet, in 1932, this is what the IRA essentially found themselves in. They were keen not to give what they called the Cosgrave Imperial Gang an opportunity to regain power, and they instead, during 1932, decided to perfect their organisation as much as possible without causing unnecessary embarrassment to the government. Over the next year, large numbers of young recruits joined the IRA, while a number of veterans also came back into its ranks, including Tom Barry, for example, who rejoined the IRA in Cork during 1932. You also then had the expansion of other Republican organisations like the Fianna or the Cumann na Mon, which went from being a very small, mainly Dublin-based group in the late 20s to a uniformed organisation of 2,000 to 3,000 women in the early 1930s. However, the experience of Fianna Fáil in government was to prove the catalyst for internal dissension within the IRA. Peadar O'Donnell and the left argued for reviving Saor Éire during 1932 and continuing social agitation. In 1933, the popular Dublin officer Frank Ryan resigned as editor of An Phoblacht, claiming that articles attacking Fianna Fáil were being censored by the IRA leadership. But by this stage, many sections of the IRA were demanding that the organisation make explicit its opposition to communism, and also that military preparations take preference to political activity. And this reflected the wider mood within the Free State, which certainly affected IRA members, which was post-1931 sees a major revival in anti-communist feeling, encouraged by the Catholic Church, and also hysterical denunciations of the left and eventually attacks on communists as well. The 1933 IRA convention, for example, voted to ban communists for being IRA volunteers. And this convention took place in a period in which Jim Gralton was arrested and eventually deported from Leitrim, and the local IRA was split over their attitude to Gralton and his activities. And while at the same period, mobs attacked the headquarters of the new Communist Party in Dublin. Gardaí noted that in Leitrim, Gralton protest meeting at which O'Donnell spoke was broken up by a crowd amongst whom were local members of the IRA. And in Dublin, while some members of the IRA, including Charlie Gilmore, went to the defence of the communists, he ended up being court-martialed, and the IRA washed their hands of his activities. And there's a detailed debate at the IRA convention, which I won't go into, but I can come back to if people want. But it's interesting, the arguments that are made by many of the delegates, and it's clear that very many of them were worried by the association of communism, atheism, anti-clericalism with the IRA. And many of them expressly said that they didn't see why the IRA should have any social policies at all. Tadhg Lynch, for example, who was a Cork officer, said, in his view, the IRA is not out to free the country for the capitalist or the worker. We are out for the freedom of all. There are many examples of money people who are as nationally minded as any other part of the community. Another officer said, "The Catholic Church tells me when it speaks it is infallible. I take that. It condemns communism. These people want all religion out of the way." Now, there was still substantial support for people like Peadar O'Donnell and George Gilmore and Frank Ryan, all who argued for a revival of Saor Éire. But when O'Donnell made the argument, as he tended to do, that what he was doing was essentially calling for a revival of the policies of people like James Connolly and especially Liam Mellows, he argued, for example, Liam Mellows was a great mind. He took the Workers' Republic newspaper as his guiding line, and that was supposed to be a communist paper. The response from people like Tom Barry was that Mellows was not infallible in these important matters. It was simply his opinion. We in 1922 would not accept his suggestions, and we don't accept them now. And actually that was quite a strong argument against O'Donnell's point. And by 1933, it's not only that many in the IRA want the organisation to renounce any connection with communism, they want the organisation to make clear that it is in fact anti-communist, because communism is associated with hostility to the church. But also crucially, by 1933, the IRA faces another problem. By then, street clashes were erupting on a weekly basis between Republicans and their opponents, notably the Blueshirts. And in popular memory, really, when people think about the 1930s, they think the fighting between the IRA and the Blueshirts really defines political conflict in the Free State. During October 1932, troops had been called out after clashes between Republicans and what was then called the Army Comrades Association in Kilmallock, County Limerick. Republicans had also disrupted a rally addressed by the Cumann na Gael leader W.T. Cosgrave in Cork during November that year, and during the same month the slogan "No Free Speech for Traitors" was used by Frank Ryan at an anti-imperialist rally in Dublin. And violence escalated over the winter of 1932, and particularly then in the early 1933, after another general election was called, you saw clashes throughout the country between Republicans and their opponents. By the summer of 1933, the Army Comrades Association had changed its name to the National Guard and also broadened its base of membership away from simply ex-Free State soldiers towards a situation where anybody essentially could join. And by this stage, they'd adopted the blue shirt as a uniform, and that's the name that they're known by. By then, they were also led by Ona Duffy, who'd been dismissed by De Valera from his post as Garda Commissioner. During the winter of 1933, blue shirt rallies saw major riots in Tralee, Kilkenny and Drogheda. In all cases, the army were called out to try and bring them under control. The numbers involved in these riots went far beyond the IRA, but their members were key to much of the trouble. In Tralee, for example, a grenade was thrown into the hall where O'Duffy was due to speak. Later that night, machine gun fire was directed at the local Garda barracks, and the IRA were the only people who could have conceivably done that in Tralee at the time. And across the Free State, the violence became endemic as Republicans and blue shirts fought at meetings, outside dance halls and on the roadside. There were several fatalities. A blue shirt died after being beaten up by IRA members in Cork. An IRA officer was fatally wounded by a blue shirt in Clare. Several other people killed as well. But I think the important thing about these clashes is that right from the beginning, the IRA leadership consistently and publicly disavowed the clashes and insisted that its members were forbidden from becoming involved in them. Now, the fact is the blue shirts actually did pose a physical threat to the IRA. They were an armed movement. The Gardaí, for example, noted that in 1932, practically every ex-army officer has under his control one or two revolvers since the pre-1922 period, and in many cases small arms which came into their possession during the Civil War have not been handed up. And this is one of the reasons why De Valera's government actually launched a major search operation of the homes of blue shirt officers, because they knew they had lots of weapons. Similarly, most local blue shirt leaders, particularly in 1932-33, were veterans of the War of Independence, and the blue shirts claimed to be upholding the memory of Michael Collins and his comrades. As Ernest Bly, one of the movement's intellectuals, would assert, the blue shirt organisation is the authentic successor of the great national movements of the past. In areas where they were strong, such as West Cork, the blue shirts were actually often the aggressors, beating up and threatening Republicans. And they were also prepared to use force in land disputes, often defending large farmers against the claims of labourers, and carry out attacks on other perceived opponents. So actually what you see in the beginning is that the IRA are often responding to what they perceive as a threat from a much larger organisation. The blue shirts at their height had perhaps 50,000 members, which means they were a lot bigger than the IRA. By 1933, the blue shirt leadership were embracing European fascist ideology and seeing themselves as the last line of defence for Ireland against the Red IRA. And the IRA did label them as fascist from the very beginning. So in part, the reaction of the IRA on the ground, I think, is inspired by fear of this organisation and what it could do to them. but the organisation nationally and their leadership were unsure of what attitude to take to the Army Comrades Association, and were initially dismissive of the potential of what they also called the White Army. They were particularly keen to avoid clashes by the winter of 1932, which would lead to the jailing of their members and cause more and more trouble for the IRA. But in many areas, IRA members, along with Fianna Fáil supporters and others, were eager to confront what they saw as the old Free State enemy in new guise. In October 1933, IRA units were given specific orders to avoid trouble. The Army Council complained that certain undisciplined, unauthorised actions are doing incalculable injury to the prestige of the Army and are in fact bringing it into contempt. These pointless actions cannot fail to create in the minds of the people the idea that our organisation is without or despises leadership and control, a fatal idea to get abroad. And the IRA leadership outlawed for its members the use of or carrying of arms for any purpose except training, any acts of violence against individuals, any intimidation or threats against individuals, holding up or searching individuals, the raiding of homes, or organised interference with political meetings. Now, the punishment for this was dismissal from court-martial and dismissal from the IRA. The problem was that so many IRA members were taking part in these activities that the publicity surrounding them very quickly became very well known. Now, if IRA members were confronted by Blueshirts, they were allowed to defend themselves. But if they were attacked by armed men, there was to be no retaliation until the facts of the incident were first conveyed to the IRA leadership. Breaking these orders would be considered acts of treachery against the Army Council. Now, whatever about in an organisation that might number a couple of hundred very disciplined people, if you've got 8,000 to 10,000 members, you can imagine what the reality was in terms of how people would respond if they were attacked by Blueshirts or if other incidents occurred. But nevertheless, this meant that you did get a whole series of very mixed messages going out to Republicans, including from Frank Ryan, for example. So in Naas during 1932, Frank Ryan is saying, "We, the Irish people, are too soft. We don't prosecute traitors. On the contrary, we protect them." That thing that was done down at Kilmallock, when these people calling themselves the White Army, white to the gills, had to be protected from the people by the military, that was a hopeful sign. But these people are getting far too much publicity, and the people should ignore them. So on the one hand, yes, it's good that people confront the Army Comrades Association. On the other hand, people should really just ignore them. Now, as you can see, even within somebody like Ryan, the confusion about this was fairly evident. Nevertheless, the violence continued into early 1934. In the spring of 1934, an IRA bomb attack on the home of a Fine Gael supporter in Drogheda killed his elderly mother. And this was very embarrassing. The organisation disclaimed it, said they didn't do it, but several of their members were arrested and jailed for it, and internally they knew they had. Their members in Dundalk had carried it out. And at the 1934 convention, which is the same convention which sees the major political dispute about the Republican Congress, heated debates took place again about the issue of the Blueshirts. Delegates were warned that they were not to interfere in any way with Blueshirts. Moss Toomey argued that not alone should the IRA abstain from attacks on meetings or interruption of speakers, they should use their influence to prevent such interference in the future. The Kerry IRA leader, J.J. Sheehy, complained of a lack of support from the Dublin leadership of the IRA, particularly as many IRA members in Kerry had been jailed because of these clashes. And he accused Moss Toomey of having turned a blind eye to attacks on the Army Comrades Association during 1932, but then becoming embarrassed by it a few months later. Toomey countered that he had no sympathy for the people being imprisoned in Kerry and claimed that for the sake of the IRA, he would have been glad to see them all hanged. So as you can imagine, this might be causing some internal tension by this point. And it's something that certainly when I was looking at the IRA in the 20s and 30s, a decade or so ago, I underestimated the extent to which they were really the Blueshirts caused huge internal problems in terms of discipline for the organisation. What became clear, of course, was that the IRA leadership only exercised loose control over a lot of its volunteers. In Kerry in particular, the bitter legacy of the Civil War was a major factor in the violence. There was no way that local IRA volunteers were going to ignore the Blueshirts because they saw them simply as the successors of the Free State Army of 1922 to 23. And the policy of non-confrontation with the Blueshirts also then obviously was a bone of contention with the IRA's left, who saw it primarily as an issue of anti-fascism. And people like O'Donnell and Gilmore talked about the need to confront the fascist threat. I think it's fair to say that while that term was used widely in the IRA, for a lot of local IRA members, their opposition to the Blueshirts was based on the fact that they were the Free Staters rather than anything else. But again, I think the language is certainly used very widely. While in Republican memory, the fighting between the IRA and the Blueshirts has achieved, as I say, iconic status, It was not a fight that the IRA's leaders ever wanted, and it was one which actually exposed fissures within their organisation to the public eye. And by late 1934, it's becoming less of an issue anyway, because the Blueshirts themselves are splintering for a variety of reasons. One of the problems was some of the areas in which the IRA had grown rapidly, such as Kerry, were sources of almost continual problems for the leadership. Young men joined the IRA expecting military action. When this wasn't forthcoming, they often soon left. But in some areas, local officers encouraged aggressive actions in order to maintain their loyalty, and this again led to jailings and arrests, and often to activities which didn't seem to have very much political purpose. Campaigns which were meant to give volunteers a focus, such as those against British goods, were stillborn. In 1934, the Fianna Fáil government set up a new volunteer reserve for the Free State Army, which was really to try and encourage young Republicans to join the state forces. While the IRA leadership sought to oppose this force by a political campaign, in Kerry and elsewhere local units carried out violent and very counterproductive attacks on the force, including bombing their barracks, holding up volunteers at gunpoint and stripping them, for example, and beating them. And because these young men were Fianna Fáil supporters, this actually led to obviously a great deal of tension between local Republicans and the IRA, and led to increasing the gap between them. Fianna Fáil leaders increasingly contrasted the organisation that they had once belonged to with this irresponsible new IRA. They alleged that IRA activity was gleefully encouraged by British and Unionist elements, eager to see a Republican government fail. By 1935, Fianna Fáil was making use of military courts and special powers, which it had denounced while in opposition, to jail both Blueshirts and IRA members, with minimal popular opposition. And I think the key point is that Fianna Fáil are able to use these powers and face very little public opposition, whereas Cumann na Gael hadn't been able to use them very effectively. The youth of the majority of IRA members was also a potent rhetorical weapon, as the response of one Fianna Fáil minister to Republican protesters illustrates. When challenged about the conditions under which IRA prisoners were being jailed, Sean McEntee asserted that he'd fought in the Easter Rising, the Black and Tan War and the Civil War, before asking those heckling him, "Can you tell me where you fought?" And again, this might be a cheap shot, but it's a very effective shot in the politics of the 1930s. The demand for the Republican movement to take a more positive role in social agitation is obviously raised at the 1934 convention, and the result is a split, with several of the IRA's leading left-wingers, including O'Donnell, Gilmore and Ryan, departing to form the Republican Congress, which has a brief, though very vibrant existence, publishes a very lively newspaper edited again by Frank Ryan, and engages in a wide variety of agitation. Now, several hundred former IRA activists joined Congress, which for a period had its own armed formation in the Irish Citizens' Army, which itself included veterans of the 1916 Citizens' Army as well. But the Congress suffered its own debilitating fracture in September 1934 over whether to become a broad front or an openly socialist party. Nevertheless, I think it's significant, though perhaps suggestive of contemporary paranoia about communism, that a senior Garda could reflect in late 1934 that it is thought that the orthodox IRA will never be a serious menace to the government as a present constituted. It is thought that the Republican Congress group under Peadar O'Donnell, which endeavours to get control of the labour organisations in the country for the purpose of creating general social disorder and internal chaos, will be a much greater menace. The more this organisation's efforts are thwarted by the existence of the orthodox IRA, the better. If the latter cease to exist, there will be much more recruitment to the Congress ranks, with the inevitable social consequences. Now again, it might be a wrong-headed analysis, but it's an interesting analysis, I think. And what the Gardaí were worried about was either an undesirable leadership such as we have in Kerry taking over the IRA, or an over-accentuation of the economic or social programme, which they believed these factors would have the effect of veering the IRA from its sentimental basis towards a social programme that inevitably makes for chaos and general unrest. But there's one factor, I think, in considering the Republican movement in the 1930s, and particularly again a movement that involves thousands of men at various stages. And this became, various material was released in 2009 in the National Archives dealing with the IRA in the 1930s. And one of the things that was released was a report by the Special Branch. And it's essentially about infiltration of the IRA. And it's from 1933. And it's worth quoting, I think, because it points to the problem that the IRA, one of the big problems that they did face. It says, in practically every county, Gardaí have established friendly contact with one or more members of the organisation. These persons within the organisation in most cases receive payment at regular intervals, but in some cases they will not take money, their motive in supplying information being that they don't want to see trouble developing locally. The ranks of these persons within the organisation vary between volunteer, company officer commanding and battalion ranks. Members of the detective branch meet them regularly and learn from them the activities in the locality. Reports are made by the detective branch verbally or in writing to local officers who report all information considered of importance to headquarters. The identity of such persons is known to local officers but is not revealed in writing. In some cases, the local officer meets them at intervals. When reporting, the officer usually states whether he considers the information reliable. The ranks only of local persons friendly disposed are known at headquarters. Efforts are made by Gardaí to check information received by references to other sources of information. Where this is not possible locally, it is possible in many cases to gauge at headquarters the strength of the information by comparison with information from other areas. Where uncorroborated information of importance is received, this is indicated in reports made to the government. Experience shows that the period of usefulness of sources of information doesn't last on average more than a couple of years. Consequently, continuous efforts have to be made to seek fresh sources of information. Generally, it is found that the more activities are undertaken by local units of the IRA, the easier it is to secure fresh sources of information. Efforts are also made to locate channels of correspondence within the organisation. Where it is known or strongly suspected that correspondence is sent by post to a particular address, application is made for the issue of a postal warrant to have all correspondence addressed to be detained by the postal authorities and delivered to the Gardaí. The correspondence is unsealed and examined by the Gardaí, copied or photographed if considered necessary, and the original resealed and returned to the post office without delay. Important information has frequently come to light in this manner. The Gardaí cannot claim, however, they know all of the activities of secret organisations. No intelligence system was ever established which could do this. Nevertheless, it's clear from reading the Garda reports in the 1930s that they did know quite a lot. And I often wondered why all the IRA documentation was badly typed out when they were originals. And of course it was because they were putting the originals back in the envelope and sending them back to the IRA. So the organisation is not only, has various political problems, but it's obviously quite widely infiltrated for a variety of reasons, which again may have to do with its size and also the fact, as the Gardaí note, that some IRA members give information because they don't want to see trouble in their local areas. Nevertheless, I think the wider political context of a greater legitimisation of the Free State is more important. Despite the split in 1934, which led to 2 more emergency IRA conventions, the organisation obviously still remained a substantial force. Increasingly, however, junior officers questioned why they weren't moving faster towards confrontation with their enemies. Armed intervention in strikes and land disputes led to fatalities and renewed state repression. In March 1935, the government claimed the IRA were planning attacks during a Dublin transport strike and carried out a wave of arrests. Senior IRA figures were forced to go on the run and Public was censored. There were again complaints from local units that the IRA had tamely submitted to the government clampdown and that they'd lost prestige, and therefore more and more calls among the ranks for the IRA to do something. Hence, by 1935, there are calls at IRA conventions for a definite date for an insurrection to be set, and therefore the decision to do just that within a year of the August 1935 convention. But obviously this didn't happen. Now the logic is there from the mid-1930s of what ultimately does happen in the late 30s, where Sean Russell comes up with an idea of an armed campaign, and this is seized on by large numbers within the IRA as just exactly what they should be doing. But the fact was, of course, that this was rooted in a political failure and political disputes as well. By 1936, war had broken out in Spain, and a number of IRA members, and particularly ex-members involved with the Republican Congress and the Communist Party, go to fight in Spain, as do some of O'Duffy's former followers in the Blueshirts, although the vast majority of Blueshirts never go anywhere near Spain either. Nevertheless, I think when considering the politics of Ireland in the mid-1930s, the question of why, in the end, it is a very small minority of people who identify with the Spanish Republic, we can't dismiss the importance of anti-communism and of the Catholic Church, and how that could even deeply impact on an organisation as radical in theory as the IRA. So, thank you.
Two fascinating papers, both I think with enormous food for thought. I'm going to give you a slight hiatus so you can gather your thoughts and ask the sorts of intelligent questions I wish I could come up with. I'm actually dazzled by the amount of information